Hi, y'all. Thanks for being here. Just gonna share my screen and get my presentation up. Okay. Um, so my farm is Tamarack Hollow Farm. I started farming in Vermont in 2010 on, say, 90 acres of rented land. I have since moved from that farm. I currently own 25 acres, in which 7 acres is in cultivation. It's certified organic vegetables in Plainfield, Vermont, which is outside Montpelier. In that time of moving from one farm to another, I've also shifted my markets a lot. I did a farm market in New York City for 13 years. Ooh, uh-oh. All right, maybe that won't move. Did a farmer's market in New York City, stopped doing that and shifted to CSA, and I'm now all wholesale. So, adaptation. I think that when we talk about climate adaptation, it can feel really overwhelming. Um, but this slide is kind of just to show like how I think about adaptation and how I've experienced it. And that as farmers are adapting all the time, the sort of above the line events here are personal events that cause major adaptation in my life and my farm. And the below the line events are more climate related things that caused my business to adapt. And just like looking at this list, you all, a lot of people have talked about wind and rain and some flooding in the chat, but how many of like these events have you experienced? An injury, changing land, changing markets. These are all things that we adapt to, and you can use the same skills that got you through those adaptations to adapt to climate change. So, my first major climate adaptation was moving my farm. If you know Burlington area at all, this is the Intervale here, and the farm I rented was up at this bend of the river. So if you've heard anything about the Intervale and all the flooding they've experienced, my farm was about 2 miles closer to the lake and fully surrounded by water on all sides, as you can see in that zoom in shot there. So year two, tropical storm Irene hits, and my farm was under 7 feet of water. I feel like that's kind of going to be the jumping off point for tonight for all three of us. Um, in my 4 years on that farm, I flooded every single month of the year except September. I had 4 or 5 growing season floods and floods every month of the kind of fall and winter as well from ice jams on that river. But being on that rented farmland was not a total waste of time. The 3 years being there gave me numbers for my business. I learned how to farm on my own as opposed to being a farm worker and wrote a business plan along with farm viability, went to a lender, got a loan to buy a farm. And that's really important to stress that these incubation farmland projects are so essential for giving beginning farmers those numbers that it's really hard to get 3 years of numbers that lenders want to see in order to buy a farm without sort of incubation land, rented land to start on. So after my fourth flood, I knew I really needed to move. I had finished my third year and had numbers. Found the farm that I now farm on and bought that for $70,000, 20 acres in 2014. It's a great find. It was only 7 acres tillable. I was shrinking down from 15 acres the previous year in production. There was no flood risk there, but no infrastructure. So 70,000, but took out a lot bigger loan than that to put infrastructure in. Spent a year preparing that land, breaking sod that had been in hay for 45 years, drilling a well, installing septic, excavating a slot for a barn, putting in a walk-in cooler, moving production to that farm, and then during that time, putting in a farm road, putting in high tunnels, just kind of endless infrastructure development. in making the decision to leave the floodplain, I know it's something that people in Vermont are, everyone's kind of trying to make that decision on their own, folks that are on the floodplain. For me, owning my farm was really important to me. And a lot of the farms that are on the floodplain are rentals, or they're renting part of it or something. And so that wasn't, buying it wasn't an option. I knew I wanted to own my farm. At the time of Irene, there were a lot of food safety concerns about vegetables in the floodplain and long-term soil health in the floodplain. And I know that has since developed, and I can't speak too much to the current science on it. I will just say that Irene was kind of more of a once in 100-year storm, and all of our soil tests, weren't showing accumulated heavy metals. That it is the floodplain. It does flood every spring or late winter. You're not seeing accumulated heavy metals. You're not seeing petroleum spills on it. And if flooding caused those things to accumulate, we would be seeing it in our soil tests. So, maybe it is safe, but then also the storms we're having now are more like Irene, where it is not just kind of the river expanding and contracting within its floodplain. It's the river going through the 3 towns ahead of you. And then whatever it took out of those businesses and those houses, it's putting onto your soil. So there is developing science around what exactly is happening here. And we don't exactly know. The nature of the flooding is changing. But the biggest thing was really, I had a 6-week crater that I knew was going to hit me at some point in the middle of the growing season. 6 weeks of it taking about 2 weeks for the soil to dry out so that you could work it, and then replanting, and then 4 weeks after planting being the soonest I could get a crop again of, a short season of arugula or radishes. I had 1 year of the 3 that I didn't flood at all. So that just became a regular part of my crop planning, was just at some point in the year, I'm probably going to lose all of this. And how quickly can we rebound? It was not a tenable long-term decision. My second big adaptation was leaving my market. This is the market I did for 10 years and what I was doing when I started my farm, what all of my debt load was based on. I did the Wednesday and Saturday Union Square green markets. So there's some statistics there about the market. I'm not going to read through the whole slide. Just say it's a very busy market. It was pretty lucrative, high sales, but also very expensive to do. I had a crew in New York City that was as big as my crew on the farm. So, double the payroll. My box truck payment was bigger than my mortgage of the farm. So, it's great numbers at that market, but very expensive to do. So when there were shifts in the operations of that market due to the pandemic, it was no longer a great market. And trying to ride out that wave was not an option because of the sunk costs of doing that market. And I think that I bring this up to just say that a lot of people don't think about the costs of their marketing plan when they're thinking about adaptation and their farm. Knowing how much it costs you to run a CSA versus a farmer's market versus an online store, versus a farm store, that these things can radically affect your bottom line. Not just the price point of your product, but the cost of doing that business. So why did I drop those farmers markets? Kind of a clash of adaptation practices. I had a baby on February 17th, and less than a month later, New York City was shut down. So just things you can prepare for. I was so well planned for having that baby. I had hired up all of my market staff, all of my farm staff, had managers in every position, had bought a second truck. We were golden. I was going to take a year sabbatical, and can't predict when it's going to happen or what's going to happen. So how did I go from zero income to not what I'm doing now? That first week just sat down with my laptop for 10-hour days. That's what that previous picture with the newborn in my lap is, and stress test my farm as tightly as I could. Take your profit and loss and put it in Excel if you don't already do this as a regular practice, and strip down to your absolute basic overhead needs. For me, those numbers were insurance, mortgage, and utilities. And what's the base production you need to have to cover those costs? And, a profit and loss will have you broken down in overhead and production costs anyway, but just kind of really stripping it down to the bare bones. I was not sure that we were going to be able to farm that season of 2020, just the physical shape I was in, not having any idea. We can all remember what March and April 2020 were like. Um, so I just kind of had to figure out like how much money do I need to make to pay my mortgage if I'm not a production farmer this season, and can I do that with like 5 acres of potatoes? Like what can me and my partner do if we fire all of our employees? Just really out of the box thinking of like drop all the assumptions you have about your farm and look at what your numbers are and how you can make them. And it can be really enlightening practice. It's now something that I do at the beginning of every season to kind of challenge my assumptions about my own business. We all get so familiar with our businesses and think we know how to do it and know what our plan is and know what our markets are. And, don't even have to look at our seeding dates if you're a vegetable farmer. I just know what they are. But challenging those assumptions can be a really valuable business planning practice. So I did all the things in this slide. I dropped a lot of specialty crops. I cold called everyone in the state. I hadn't sold a vegetable within the state of Vermont in 7 years, I think, when Irene hit or when COVID hit. Maybe it was 5 years since I dropped the Burlington Farmers Market, but just cold called people, told them what was happening for me. This is how long I've been farming. These are the crops I grow. What can I sell to you? It was a really lucky time in that I had a walk-in cooler that still had carrots and potatoes and turnips and radishes in it. And the tunnels were just starting to flush with greens. So I could kind of get my foot in the door with those products, and local stores were seeing a lot of demand for unconventional sales routes. So it worked to make that shift. But I suddenly was thrown into doing lots of small local deliveries, and we started a CSA, which, I was not really equipped to run or to do. And it became apparent very quickly that if I was going to change my markets, I needed to change the crops I was doing. That change in markets and crops was going to change the profitability assumptions that I had as a retail farmers market farmer. And that if all of those profitability changes were happening, I needed to upend my production system assumptions and change productions and find efficiencies that as a retail farmers market farmer, I just didn't need because the cash flow was so constant. So this is what that shook out as. This was my income 2019. And that wholesale is from that farmer's market. So I know it like says wholesale, but that is just pre-orders that we had walking into that farmer's markets versus, and I think that grant was like a high tunnel grant I got that year. So versus 2020, the end of that year, that 14% or that 5% green market, that was just like January and February green market, still sent some down wholesale at the end of the year, actually. And then, but like half New York City and grants, a lot of pandemic relief grants that year, like PPP and state grants, and then half New York, half Vermont. And that was all market I created that year. So I look at those 2 years as like kind of a failure of like, I was just treading water, like in survival. And I try to be gracious that like survival mode is not necessarily a failure. We did produce boxes for a few weeks where people could sign up for them, and there was a lot of demand for those. So then I committed to doing a CSA, but then vaccines came out and people weren't as into CSA, but I had already committed to doing it 2020, so that we did that through 2021. And then 2021 autumn, the city kind of started to reopen up with vaccinations. Restaurants were able to reopen. We started sending more stuff down to New York City wholesale, but kind of had a foot in both worlds. And then 2022 was a really droughty year here. And I had been trying to shift over with looking for those production efficiencies, had been trying to shift over to more hardware crops as opposed to this really specialty crops I had been doing for the farmer's market. So it was really concentrating on salad mix production, potatoes and carrots, all of which don't do great in a drought, and had dropped kind of all of my favorite and more profitable crops, and had a toddler running around at my feet. It was just a really hard time. but I want to stress that that's sometimes part of adaptation is that treading water and just knowing that you're like just that compass is up there for a reason, like looking for opportunities, covering your expenses, that stress test that I talked about earlier of knowing like it's okay. I did a stress test this winter. We have terrible carrot germination. We're looking at 30% of the crop, but I did a stress test this winter and I know that we can be okay without the carrots. Having those numbers in the back of your mind to refer to can really help deal with the emotional stress of farming in a changing climate. Um, and just like keeping that compass point of knowing what you're looking for your business. Last adaptation practice I'm going to talk about is the big storms we've been having recently in Vermont. And I don't know how bad it has been in Maine, but this is what a farm that does not flood in Vermont has looked like for the past 2 summers. This picture was taken 5 days after the 2023 flooding event, which is the one that flooded Barre and Montpelier. My farm sits in a triangle in the middle of Barre, Montpelier, and Plainfield. Plainfield was the town that was one of the towns that was wiped out in the 2024 floods. So we're right in that valley that's been hitting all these towns. And this is what our farm looks like the last few seasons. So this was a challenge to the adaptations I had gone through before of moving a farm and changing a market. This was much harder because the whole farm is affected at once. You can't stick hoe that mud. You can't tractor cultivate that mud. That's what fields look like all season, and had to learn how to make really hard decisions. How do you make those hard decisions? Crop enterprise budgeting. Um, if you don't know what crop enterprise budgeting is, I can't necessarily explain it in the 7 minutes I have left or anything, but I can give you quick examples. You need to know all of your costs of input. You need to look at your maximum output you can get from that field and figure out crop to crop what is making you the most money. And then when you have an event like it was in that previous slide, you know what's the most important thing to save. We had to hand weed our whole farm the last 2 years, which is not a regular practice for us. So knowing a priority list of these are the most important crops, we're going to go out and save these crops first, and then going down the line of what the profitability of each of the crops are. So what order their importance to the farm is in. Something I would say for crop enterprise budgeting is that your numbers don't need to be perfect to be useful. When I first learned about this practice, I was really intimidated by the amount of data you need to collect. And like, this is what mine looks like. It's not perfect. If you've looked at Richard Wiswall's spreadsheets, they are much more extensive. And that's great if you can do it, but it doesn't need to be perfect to be helpful. If you're doing enterprise budgeting, which is like comparing livestock to cabbage growing, you want to have really good numbers because you're not comparing apples to apples. Like if your cultivation practice cost is off by $5, it doesn't really matter if you're comparing cabbage and cauliflower, but if it's cabbage and pigs, it's going to matter. But it's going to help reveal assumptions about what's most important to your farm, test management practices, which can be really important when you're looking at climate adaptation practices of like, okay, there's a new pest showing up in my area. Let's just row cover everything. You can test that on a spreadsheet of like, how much does it cost in labor and materials to cover crop or to row cover all of your beds? And it might not be profitable to do that crop with that practice. And it's cheaper to find out in Excel than to find out in your field. Where's my farm at now? We're all wholesale now. It's a 50% split between local wholesale up in Vermont and wholesale that's all going down in New York City. It's still a split between hardware crops, carrots and radishes, and specialty crops. I do a lot of radicchio production and forced radicchio production as a season extension practice that's inside, which is great. We grow season extended crops out in our high tunnels, but winter is very variable. If it's too warm, you get a lot of disease. If it's too cold, you have die off. It's nice to have a season extension practice that's inside. Pushing season extension and late plantings as far as back into August as we can. And currently assessing the risk of growing my business, taking on more debt, which I don't really have the appetite for right now. And what I want personally for my life being I turned 40 this year. I'm looking at the next 20 years of farming versus my first 20 years of farming and have kids now and time with my family and a healthy relationship to the business for them is the most important adaptation I have had to make as a farmer. I don't know where I'm at it for a time. I'm going to leave this slide up as my last slide. These are resources that have helped me in my adaptation journey. If you don't know what any of these are, you should check them out.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Amanda. That was I mean, such a great story. And I really appreciate the your perspective on like the adaptation that we're doing all the time, both personally and as farmers, and that those skills translate. And just like, the long history of adaptation that we're all doing. Very cool. Next up is going to be Bruce. Um, Bruce from Maplewood Farm has an awesome story to tell, and really glad to welcome him to share how they're approaching building resilience in the face of climate change.
Well, thanks, folks. I don't mind questions. If you have any questions during my presentation, or if something isn't clear, please uh, jump in the chat, and these guys will let me know um, how things are going there. Just a quick introduction. We're Maplewood Farm. We're coming into our 27th season of work as a diversified pasture-based livestock farm and USDA processing plant. This is our mission. Um, I think this is the core of any kind of resilience and adaptation is to understand exactly why you exist and what you're working for, and having all your decisions go through this lens has been super helpful for us when we didn't really have this clear picture. Things were a lot less clear about where we were going and why we were doing things. So I would highly recommend thinking about that and having that. So these are all our enterprises. 100% grass-fed beef, pasture-raised poultry. We have layers for eggs, which we do year-round, and then we do turkeys and broilers and pigs on pasture as well. Here's the broiler set. All the poultry that we do on farm are put out into these field shelters during the grazing season, and we move those daily onto new grass. And so we're a daily move operation in that respect. On organic pastures, though, we don't actually produce any certified organic uh, products because we're using non-GMO feed, not certified organic, but but we're on certified organic pastures while we're doing it. Um, and I guess the biggest part of this that's kind of interesting and where we are right now is that uh, kind of aside from what Amanda was just talking about, she made decisions to move away from floodplains to feel more secure in her farming situation, and actually what we were looking for back in just before Irene was large tracts of flat land with no rocks. And guess where those are? They're in our river bottom lands. And the reason that we wanted those is that we wanted to be a pastured poultry operation primarily, and for that you need large flat pieces of ground where you can move these large mobile range coops, MRCs. So that was kind of, we were going against the gradient there, and kind of made our bet on what we were going to do going forward based on our choice there. and it has proven to be difficult sometimes. We also have a USDA poultry and meat processing plant. We slaughter poultry during the growing season, and then we add value to poultry and pork during the rest of the year. Um, and probably our most profitable enterprise, but also kind of takes the most effort and time, particularly with regulation and those kinds of things. So that puts us in a situation where we are um, helping other people uh, also get their birds to market in a much bigger way than they could without USDA inspection. So that's a little bit of an unfair advantage that we have, capturing some of the economic benefits of that going forward for other farms. So that leads us to kind of our floods. We were certainly part of Irene. I have to say, maybe because I wasn't paying attention or I just didn't believe it, that Irene, which did hit us very hard, but didn't have the same impacts that it had after we started putting mobile range coops on our big bottomland fields. Um, we went a long time without seeing a lot of flooding after Irene, and that kind of lulled us into the idea that we could operate with impunity down in the bottomlands. I'm sure Amanda and Ryan would be familiar with this graphic. Um, this is a flow forecast for the Winooski River from the NOAA uh, hydrology lab. This is coming out of the dam near Waterbury. And in 2023, we follow this very closely when there's any kind of flooding forecast. And you can see here, if you're looking carefully, if you're on a larger screen anyway, that they're talking about moderate flooding being over around midnight on July 10th. Um, and what we experienced during that time, we made some decisions based on this forecast and the probabilities that they were showing about a 5% probability that it would go higher. We thought that was a fairly good bet, so we made decisions based on that. So it shows that peak flow, and then it shows us decreasing from about midnight to the following day. And what the actual flow did was go about 8 feet higher than that, and it didn't peak until the following day. And this was the result. Um, we had our one of our primary bottomlands completely turned into a lake, like it did during Irene. We had 400 turkeys out here in in an MRC, and then in a field down in Bolton that we lease, we lost another 700 chickens to not flooding from the river, but actually the water table rising about 4 feet in that area. So there was no flow there. It was just water rising right up through the soil and drowning our chickens. And it was so, to me, the calculations that we made and all the work, we had already removed over 4,000 birds from this field because they were in lower sections. And we made the decision to leave our turkeys in place because we felt like they were safe based on the forecast and what we were seeing. And then 5:30 the next morning, we realized that that wasn't going to be safe anymore. And I made the very astute observation that I should try to drive in there with resulted in the loss of our 100 horsepower tractor. So a lot of mistakes all around there on our part. So I guess I'll move on from there. we spent a lot of time soul searching after that. We had put in, again, we'd been really on top, felt like we were really on top of it. We made really key decisions. I was out there at 11 o'clock at night making assessments, thinking we were still safe, and it still didn't work. So we wrote a flood response plan, and these are the bones of it. We do still follow the weather, but we don't trust it. Um, we we've decided that no matter what, if there is a flood forecast and a major storm coming, that we would add 20% of additional precipitation and flooding into our calculations. So again, adding another 6 to 8 feet of our expectation would have resulted in a very different situation had we done that. So we also identified areas that we knew to be 100% safe. And then we made a decision not to operate in 100%. All of that decision that we took out of production. And that was on our part, but we just felt like we couldn't take the risk. We still operate on that major field, but with systems that we know we can remove in a few hours. And then we also realized that we had to start much earlier. So, you can generally trust the forecast 3 days out before an event. And as soon as we saw that there was that possibility, we had to start moving animals and equipment and 3 days out to have the time to get them into the safest place possible. And then to have boats and other tools on hand. So that, what we ended up doing and what you really can't see in this picture is that there are people out here, me and 3 or 4 other staff members out here actually picking up turkeys that were in the water unconscious that we put into canoes and brought back, put into these crates, and then warmed them up and saved some of them. But obviously, most of them perished in that event. But the result of our flood response plan in 2024, when we had almost exactly the same event, as most of you are aware, was that when we followed this plan, we had zero animal loss. And that was a big deal for us because we felt a lot more prepared. We understood the parameters that we had to operate in. And so that was a great result. We still had a great deal of road, fence, and water system damage, but no loss of animal life or equipment. So that was great. We felt really good about that. And then 1 month later, when Tropical Cyclone Debbie came through, dropped a microburst and destroyed our equipment barn. After we had already made decisions about moving animals to appropriate places and all of those different things, we really had we felt like we had done it. As a matter of fact, we were all standing in the parking lot. I wouldn't say congratulating ourselves, but feeling good that we had made the right decisions for this particular storm, which was right at the beginning of August. And then a twister touched down and took down giant cottonwoods right on top of our equipment shed. So that was a kick in the teeth. And we really had to take that in stride, of course. And it ended up being a lot of extra work during the season. But one of the things that we've taken from this is that really the only thing we can control is how we respond. This is an interesting picture because the first thing that we did after we lost the barn was we dispersed as a crew and went around and looked at all of our different fields with MRCs in them because we thought if those things had um, if if a microburst had hit our barn, it might have hit these other shelters. And if anyone has dealt with mobile greenhouse structures like this, um, you know that these can fly if you're not very careful. So we went out and looked, and every all of our animals were okay, and all of the shelters were okay, but we got this double rainbow. So um, I think for me, this was symbolic of just understanding that each of these major disasters that we've encountered is also an opportunity to completely um, renew your commitment and ability to move forward. And these are some of the ways that we've done that. The first thing we did was decide, hey, because we're not really using our bottomland field, that third that we took out of primary production, we're going to do something fairly short term and start raising pigs down there instead. So this is our bottomland. You can also see incredible amount of invasive uh, plant material down there that didn't exist in the past that came in on the floods were part of what's going on. And so we decided to really disrupt that system and then to come in afterwards. And I guess I got to go out of this to get into the next one, but I will go there. So the other thing that we started to do was try to deal with the nutrient loss that we were getting with some of the flooding that was happening, and to actually add in some plant diversity into our field. So we have very, very light soils, not heavy clay. And when the flood waters recede, there's a lot that leaches out. And so what we wanted to do was rip through the um, compaction zone that we had there and access some subsoil nutrients at the same time planting in deep rooted forbs and other types of plants to build a radical diversity of plants in these pastures, to really promote a soil health and kind of the greater diversity of types of plants, not just within a certain species like grasses, but the greater diversity of types of plants really can start to build a synergistic effect for soil health. And so using this subsoil or rip sowing uh, machine to help us do that was one of the things that we turned to help us with our soils there. And then, we're looking at losing about 20% of our income by dropping that third, the land that we were deciding not to use in a primary way anymore. And so we started to think about, okay, how can we adapt our business to the reality that we just don't have the same amount of land that we can raise animals on? And how can we become something different that people will respond to? And so the first thing that we came up with was that we had already made a pivot through COVID, we'd made a huge pivot towards direct-to-consumer sales and marketing. We started an on-farm store, and we'd had an online store through Shopify for a number of years. And we really focused on that and focused on selling kind of at that retail level. And through that, we realized, hey, you know what? Right now, we're outstripping the amount of product that we actually produce is not lasting kind of through the winter until the next season when we can start over again. And we started to understand that if we could curate and source products that were very similar or the same as ours from the networks that we've developed over the last, you know, 2.5 decades, and help people understand that they can get that from us at any time, making that commitment to our customer base and to the community that we've developed was going to be a really big deal. And so we started our regenerative network, and now we have partner farms that also sell into our program at wholesale so that we can uh, sell their items at retail if we're out of the stuff that we're producing ourselves. And that's met with a tremendous amount of positive response from our community and a building customer base. So that's been one really big adaptation that we've done, and I found that it's really satisfying to kind of enter in partnerships with folks we've known for a long time that really do a nice job with what they're producing, but that don't want, that don't really enjoy selling direct to consumer and kind of building their customer base one individual at a time or one family at a time. And then the second thing that we did was we started looking at everything that we were doing and trying to go even further with using every little piece of the animals that we were working with. And that was through developing a pet treat line called Pasture Pet. And we're just in the fledgling stages now, but we have about 25 stores open with that product now, moving hopefully to several hundred within the next several years. And most of the stuff that we make into really high value pasture-based pet treats, we used to put into our compost pile. And that's something that's helped us bridge that gap of revenue and profit that we lost in making a decision to take out a third of our production space. So the other thing that we've done is really starting to cast our net widely and look for ways to deal with some of the climate related effects that we're seeing with our animals, particularly in the winter when they get cooped up a bit. Obviously, avian influenza has been a huge uh, thing in the news lately, and we've been worried about it, of course, and we've always had kind of security, uh, biosecurity issues that we've had to deal with over time. But we started looking in the research and actually working in our cohort in the land care cooperative cohort that we have here in Vermont, which is just a learning cohort and a research cohort of primarily livestock and grazing farmers that are working on soil health and other ways to keep our animals healthy. And we've started to do a lot of work with lactic acid bacteria and brewing that ourselves on the farm and then spraying that into the environment and trying to flip over the microbiome environment in our shelters. We're planning on taking that out to the field and irrigating with it behind our shelters as they move forward to capture more nutrients and have a quicker uptake of nutrients into the soils as our MRCs or cows or pigs pass through those areas. That's met with a tremendous amount of success, and anecdotally, I can say that we have seen dramatic increases in flock health in our layers that we keep through the winter. Normally, that's a time when things can be a little tough on these birds because they're fairly close together and they're not out moving every day onto new grass. With lacto spray on a daily basis, we've seen a drastically reduced mortality rates and a much higher lay rate for our layer hens than we've seen in the past. And we're really excited to see how this does in our brooder setups and out on pasture. We're working on automated misting systems for our pasture-based shelters going forward. So that's the end of my presentation. Obviously, there's a lot more that we're doing, and I really appreciated seeing Amanda's numbers-based adaptations there. I've got a lot of that if people want to see it. I've got a tremendous amount of those kinds of numbers if you want to see them. But for now, I'm going to pass it on to Ryan.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Bruce. Really loved hearing your story and love that reminder of the only thing you can control is how you respond, I think is great. Um, Seeing some questions about lactobacillus in the chat, and so maybe that's something we can all, folks that are interested in, can talk with you about in the breakout group.
100%.
Cool. And yeah, without further ado, we'll pass it to Ryan of Evening Song Farm.
Thanks. I'll figure out how to share my screen. And really neat to hear from Bruce and Amanda and just seeing the thoughtfulness of your approaches. And I think the other thing I often think about is how um, just how powerful the effect of cumulative small improvements is, or just having a direction to move in, and the changes that can be made from one year to the next, and how those pile on top of each other and can just lead to so much change over a period of time. It was neat to see how what that looked like on your farms. I'm going to be talking about managing excessive rainfall on our vegetable farm with 4 acres of production. This is an aerial shot of our farm recently, and on where we grow now. Originally, back in 2011, this was a different location that we were growing at. This was the original Evening Song Farm, 2 miles away in the Mill River Valley. And we had a single season of growing vegetable crops there before August 29th, Tropical Storm Irene caused the Mill River to um, overflow onto our fields and carve a new path through our vegetable fields. So when we came back after evacuating that day, the river was going through where our crops were. You can see in this stitched together photo here how drastically the landscape changed within just a few hours. And here's another before and after of just showing the extent of the scouring away of soil on that spot. And so in a way, it was fortunate that for us that the damage was so extensive because it made it very clear that we weren't going to farm on this piece of land again. And it also brought in a lot of community support for us as we were pretty new in the area, and a lot of which led to us being able to access a piece of land just a couple miles away to continue to grow on. And so this is like Amanda, the land that we started over on was land with no infrastructure on it, and so we built that up over a few years of being on this location. However, this is sloping land on our new location that we had never grown on sloping land before. And so in our first year, it became clear that our raised bed, kind of attempt at clean cultivation growing methods weren't going to be weren't well adapted to the sloping fields that we moved to. You can see in the gully erosion on the photo on the right. And so we tried a lot of different things over the years to try to address that. With some amount of success, but this photograph from 2019 shows, 7 years later, we were still struggling with how to farm vegetables on sloping land without losing our soil to erosion. And in 2019, there were two real strategies that emerged beginning around then. And the first was to divide our field into 40-foot wide pads that we could tarp, and in between those pads to install swales that would move water across the slope and off of the field. And it took me a long time to realize that the real fundamental issue that we were coming up against, growing vegetables on sloping land, was that the water, any runoff on our fields, would have a long way to run down the field. And in that run down, several hundred feet of moving down our fields, and it would kind of channelize more and more as it got farther down on those fields in times of runoff. So this installing swales along the field to move the water sideways was our strategy to limit that amount that water could run down our fields. And secondly, this was a strategy that became more clear to me over time to develop growing practices for a wide variety of crops that would allow for rapid infiltration of rainfall and maximize the soil retention of water. And I think I'd probably also include in that bucket growing practices that don't expose bare soil to the elements. So this is what it looked like the year that we installed those swales. We hired some machinery to put them in. We spent a lot of time with a laser level and a measuring tape and stakes, marking out where the swales were going to go and trying to get them as good as we could to make the most of this investment that we were doing. This is a completed swale that was seeded and mulched. And then several months later, this is a tarped field with a grassy swale to the left and right of this field. And so then with these swales installed, we're able to grow crops on these 40-foot wide sections and really minimize the water that has the ability of water to travel in long runs down the length of our field. And so the other things that we've had to think about with this are, well, then where does the water go after that? And some of the things that we discovered are, one is that stone walls are a really amazing resource for infiltrating water. That a lot of the times some of our swales just run right into a stone wall that runs up and down the length of the field. And it was sort of a guess. I didn't know if I was going to regret doing that or need to change it or what, but it worked out really well. And there's just so much porosity in those stone walls, and it really allows for excellent infiltration of water. And then in this photo here, there's a ditch that moves water down the field that early on we planted really heavily with some of the wild willows that were just growing around here. And you can see those willows growing in the ditch, slowing the water down. And I often just check our ditches to see if we have water that's running clear like this in there. That's what we want. The other thing that I do a lot of, probably I imagine many other vegetable growers here do as well, is just going outside when there's really heavy rain and seeing what's happening on the fields. And if that's not something that you do already, I really strongly recommend it because it's just so illuminating to see what is happening when intense rain is coming down. But it was especially necessary after doing this kind of manipulation to our landscape to move water because it occurred to me as we were doing this that all of this water, that what we're doing essentially is channelizing water on our field in a different way, in a way that is more appropriate to the production that we're doing. So along all of these swales, all the water that might run off of a field is channelized in the swale moving across the field. And if that water were to rise up, if there was a low spot in the field below it, and that water were to go over in that field, then all that channelized water would run right over the field below it, causing erosion in that field. And so early on, I just started going outside and walking around our farm anytime there was heavy rain, and mostly it was okay, but there were some areas over the following years that needed to be touched up a little bit and have some soil brought in to fill out the top bed of the next field to make it a little to keep that water in the swale. And then that was just kind of fixing up those vulnerable spots, which took a few years to really dial in, and now it works pretty well whenever we do have runoff. But I think the whole goal, once we have a system like this, is to improve the water infiltration and retention on our farm so that more of that water soaks into the soil and less runs off over the field into the swale below. And this is a photograph here of a field that we did some bare fallowing on to remove perennial weeds from this field. And that kind of excessive tillage of this field left this soil vulnerable to not being able to absorb rainfall nearly as fast as some of our other fields. You can see in the surface crusting on this field after a heavy rain. And the most useful kind of, I don't know, simple understanding of the role of soil structure in water infiltration was explained to me a while ago. I can't remember from who, that heavily tilled soil like this is kind of like akin to a bowl of all-purpose baking flour. And if you were to pour water over the top of that fine baking flour, it doesn't just soak right in. It kind of hits the top and runs off over it. Whereas well-structured soil, like you can see in this photo here, with organic matter in various stages of decomposition in the soil in little crumbles rather than finely pulverized grains. Well-structured soil like this is more like a loaf of bread with a crust cut off, and that water can just seep right through that soil without moving the particles around and without running off over the surface. So the goal on our farm is to use these production zones that we have set up with the swales in between them to grow crops in soil that looks like this. And so there's a lot of ways that we have to do that I'll run through very quickly right now. One of those is high residue no-till. So this is a rye cover crop that's been flattened just by floating the bucket of the tractor over the soil, not with a specialty, not with a roller crimper or anything, just with a tractor bucket to flatten it. And then a tarp is put over it to kill that rye. About 10 days or more after the tarp is removed, and there's a really nice mulch on the soil surface, and also a very robust dead root system of the cover crop in the soil. And so we go through with a toolbar and some coulters to cut slits through that rye. This is what it looks like after the coulter comes through. It kind of breaks up the soil just a bit to facilitate fairly easy hand transplanting into that slit. And then all those crops grow with that residue right on the surface. And so a field like this is really good at soaking in water during intense rain. And the mulch on the soil surface really basically eliminates any risk of erosion while we're growing a crop on this field. And this is a field of brassicas ready for harvest, grown in that way. So that's a really good method for any crops grown late in the season, fall brassicas especially. And this right here was just so illuminating for me when we do get these big heavy rains. This was July 11th, 2023, right after our farm got 6.5 inches of rain. Just seeing the difference between a high residue field that we have on the left, that's sweet clover residue, and then on the right where we had just done some shallow tillage to direct seed some green beans in that field. The difference is just so striking, and it is so motivating for me to develop systems that can better infiltrate water and better protect our soil. So another one of those systems is transplanting into clover sod. This is some Dutch white clover that was undersown you can make out the dead residue from peppers and eggplant from the year before. We mowed this field just with a riding lawnmower, and then set out bands of compost on top of that mowed clover, thick enough to plant a transplant right into the compost. And then we planted some Brussels sprouts in here and set up some irrigation over them because the compost is prone to drying out. So it's important to have some irrigation to keep that compost moist while the Brussels sprouts take their time to root into the mineral soil. And then as the clover grows back like this, we mowed it once. This is what the mowed clover looks like with Brussels sprouts. We had some peppers and zucchini that we tried this way as well. And then it grew a really nice crop of Brussels sprouts that way, and was really cool to grow these without over a clover sod without having to do any tillage to that field and having all those living roots in the soil. So some of the other techniques that we use, we discovered that a mill nearby has white ash and yellow birch bark that they grind up and sell to us at an affordable rate. And so we've been putting that on our fields as a mulch quite extensively, just simply by hand with scooping it up on a big pallet on the front of our tractor like this, and then applying it with some aluminum scoop shovels over transplanted crops. And that's just been an awesome practice for us in our farm, in our context, to be able to grow really uh, beautiful vegetables with very little weed control, protecting the surface of the soil from rain, and the mulch is really sponge-like, and it really helps the water soak into the soil and really reduces any erosion risk. So here's some sugar snap peas that we planted and mulched, and then at harvest. Um, this is what it looks like after we harvested a mulch crop and seeded a cover crop in there. Depending on how thick it gets put on and other factors, it has various rates of breaking down into the soil. And so then another thing, I've been really excited about this and really looking forward to learn a bit more about it, is this semi-permanent mulch ridges that we use. These are onions growing on these ridges. And so to kind of take you through the cycle of this, in July we do as much tillage or tarping as necessary to eliminate perennial weeds and loosen as subsoil compaction. Um, we make ridges, seed a winter-killed cover crop, and then flatten those ridge tops. And then in October or November, the cover crop begins to winter kill, and we'll spread straw mulch over that whole field for the winter on top of that dying cover crop. And then the following spring, we'll peel that straw back off the tops of the ridge and then apply a band of compost right on those ridge tops. And then what we're left with is a really nicely mulched field where we can plant onions fairly densely on this composted ridge top and have excellent weed control growing onions without, we used to use black plastic to grow our onions, and this was the way that we found to move away from that. And then a single hand weeding in June or July, and we grew a really nice crop of onions like that. Um, and then after harvesting, a little weeding touch up. There's a few beneficial flowers we planted in there, and we were able to establish some fall crops in the same ridges. And so that's just been an awesome system for us. And then the mulch field gets mulched again and can be planted again next spring. Um, but growing in those heavily mulched ridges, here's some ridges mulched with bark mulch in the on the sides and in the valleys, has been has just been a really awesome way to grow vegetables that otherwise are difficult to grow without pulverizing the soil and making it vulnerable to those excessive rains. So here's some ridge tops that are mulched with compost and seeded to fall carrots, and then oversown to crimson clover. And then those carrots at harvest. It was just so cool to grow carrots this way without needing to have that bare soil exposed. And then finally, by comparison, this photo on the right is the field of our kind of standard, how we used to grow our fall carrots. A lot of bare soil, a lot of heavy machinery traffic to undercut those carrot beds and harvest them, and no opportunity to plant a cover crop late in the season. In contrast, the ridge field where we grew our carrots on the left, there's no bare soil exposed and a crimson clover cover crop that's coming up underneath there. So that was really rewarding, and I'm looking forward to um, continuing to develop that mulched ridge system. And that's all I have for my presentation.
Amazing. Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. So cool. I love seeing just the way you're rethinking how you're producing food and how you're growing on your new farm. It's really inspiring. Um, cool. So for the next about 15 minutes, we are going to break out into smaller groups and have a conversation with each other as farmers here in New England. And Meg is going to break you out. There's going to be one group with Amanda, one group with Ryan, and one with Bruce. So feel free to pick whichever is speaking to you. And just a prompt for us to sort of spur the conversation is I'd love y'all to just be thinking and sharing what you're doing on your own farms to adapt to climate change and what successes you're seeing, and also sort of what challenges you're experiencing in the process. And I think it'll be really cool to just learn from each other because we had three perspectives, but there's a lot more ways to do this.